Analyst, and I'm getting the recording started because that's important. Um, if you are just joining us and this is your first session of the day, please note that as the admin, I do not work for Zoom. But if you are having any trouble with any part of this presentation or anything else that's going on today, please let us know. We'll do the best that we can to see you situated. If you have any questions for our panelists, type them in early. Get them started during the process of the presentation. It keeps conversation flowing. If you want to ask your question yourself, you can always raise your hand or ask to. We can allow you to speak in that. And yeah, we'll just wait for the rest of our panelists. I can see they're all there now, so they can pop on over when they're ready, and we'll get you all started. There's one, there's two, and three. Everyone's here. Fabulous.
Mm.
Okay, so welcome everybody to our Russian propaganda panel. It is my pleasure to introduce Roberto of Tsar Power, JP Bristow of the Russian Empire History Podcast, and Mark Schaus of Russian Rulers History Podcast. Take it away, gentlemen.
Okay. Well, the first thing I think we wanted to discuss was our good old friends, the Okhrana, the secret police of old Russia, the Russian Empire. Uh, believe that was started back in the time of Tsar Alexander III, if I'm not mistaken, after the assassination of his father, the Alexander II. And I've had people comment to me in my podcast that the Russian czars didn't have any secret police. This is all started by the communists and the Bolsheviks during, 1917. Actually, it goes back, I think the first real uh, secret police were the secret because of 1654. So going back, they had seven different versions of the secret police for about that time. And you can actually also add Ivan the Terrible's, or I don't like using the terrible, his term, I like Grozny, the awesome.
The
Uh,
formidable, as I like to use.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, they had, if you add them, you'll have about eight different or secret police from the period of Ivan all the way over to, the third section and then the Okhrana. And so,
Mhm.
that's part of their propaganda was to get people, uh, to be on both sides. The assassins of the Okhrana were actually double agents. They would be part of either the Bolsheviks or the social revolutionaries, and giving information to the uh, czarist regime. So they went both ways on this, and there is some brief evidence that Joseph Stalin was one of those people. That he was, played both sides of the same coin. So, what do you guys think on that?
With
Yeah, well, go ahead, Roberto.
no, you go ahead, JP.
I think we're both going to be talking about this, aren't we?
Well, yes. So even on the topic of Stalin potentially being a double agent, with the research that I've done, I don't think that's possible, mostly because he did start off as a monk in Georgia. Um, and with that, going from monk to revolutionary to, to also being a train robber. I don't think he was already working too much against the state to begin with to even be considered a potential secret police. And I know there are people who have been double agents, but Stalin's been pretty much a straight and narrow. I'm against the imperial regime, so he was known for it too. So that's kind of like where I fall on that side.
Yeah, I think I'm with Roberto on this one.
My concern was just that he had gotten out of some of his exiles awfully easily, and maybe he didn't act as totally as a double agent, but he, fed him enough information that they let
Mhm.
him, escape on his own.
There's a lot of incompetence around as well.
That is also true. The guards, especially down south, don't really. care, and give them a bottle of Georgian wine, things will be nice and easier.
When we look at the secret police of the Soviet Union, they had as many as, they changed their names every few years, from
Hmm.
like the Cheka to the GPU, OGPU, NKVD, and on and on and on, KGB. It's like anytime they wanted to get, change course, they just changed their name and shoot all the people that were involved in the last group of the secret police. So,
Hmm.
and they continue to this day with the FSB, the SVR, and those other organizations, that it's just a continuation of the secret police. And I think, that's part of the, their deception, their paranoia. They're always thinking that somebody's an enemy, internal, external, wherever it be.
And then even with the secret police in general, I think because the Russians are obviously the most famous ones to have secret police. And because what's, when you think of it, what's the first thing you think of? The KGB. And and in this situation, especially like it harkening back to Imperial Russia, it's at a time where post the abolition of serfdom, you see the rise of these fringe movements within the empire. And because they're no longer being worked over by the nobility, people have more freedom to do the things that they would like because they're no longer bound. Well, they're not as bound to the land because Russia still has an internal passport system. So you're basically stuck within the area you grew up in. And you have to get permission to move around at the time. Um, so with that, it gave a good sense of having a secret police to counter these movements, and especially because Alexander III was known for being quite how do I put this lightly, a bit of a jerk. And he's very strong. He basically would strong arm everything to the point that strong arm it to incompetence would be the best way to say it. Because he just hit things with a hammer. He had no finesse to it. And the Okhrana was just a response with no finesse to just dissolve issues without actually facing the actual problem within his nation.
I have to thoroughly agree. I mean, he left a bad situation for his even more incompetent son, Nicholas II,
Hmm.
who, was never really trained to be czar and didn't have any real need, or not need, but want to be a czar. And
Well,
I just think that Alexander just reacted because of the death of his father, the way he
mhm,
assassinated, and he saw the horrors, as did Nicholas. And instead of trying to find out why they're doing this, just pound him over the head, as he said, with a hammer.
mhm.
And it was his only way of crudely trying to figure out what was going on in his crumbling nation.
What are your thoughts, JP?
Yes, I mean, of course, we also have to remember that Russia is where terrorism, as we understand it, also developed. So the Okhrana wasn't merely proposed as an instrument for repressing social movements that were appearing. They did actually have issues to deal with assassinations and so on going on, which of course they ended up contributing to with their double agents.
Hmm.
There was quite a number of people like Peter Strzopin, and some of the others who were, mayors and governors of different regions of Russia were being assassinated in the late 19th century. It was a continuation of that, and they had to try to find out where it was coming from, and it would spark one of the leaders of the Bolshevik movement, Lenin. When his brother was executed, Alexander, that for trying to assassinate the Tsar, and so that gave him real anger at the Russian. So what does he do? He creates an even more powerful secret police in the Cheka to terrorize anybody that he deemed to be, against him, and their paranoia was far greater. And then of course, you get Stalin, who, is the definition of paranoia, in my opinion, with his, killing of millions of people, and it was whether they were true enemies or not.
Yeah.
Hmm. And even then, looks like even the movement, because you can see, because there's just like here's the main theme with like the secret police. It's just that, and as you mentioned before, you're always killing the original head because as forces change power, you're removing the people in charge. So once Lenin died, Dzerzhinsky, well, after Dzerzhinsky died, and then Lenin passed not too long afterwards, it moved over to the NKVD, which was led by Stalin and Beria, essentially. And
Well,
then
originally by Yagoda, and then
you know that,
Yagoda was, shot,
yeah,
and then you had Yezhov, and he was shot, and then you get Beria, and of course, what happened to him?
he shot.
He was shot.
So, but yes, and even with that, you have all of these predecessors getting shot no matter what you do. So even the secret police ends up being as a self-fulfilling prophecy at the end of the day because by having it, it's only shoring up the power of the person in charge. And once that person is dead, the next person can come in. If the head of the organization doesn't take charge immediately, they're gonna end up shot because they're the one who hold the records against everybody else. Because Beria, as as most famously seen in Death of Stalin, had records on everybody. Um, and with that, that's what made everyone go against him because one, he was a horrible, horrible person, and everybody else recognized that. But because he was Stalin's pet, essentially, people had to deal with him, and he had all this blackmail on them. And secondly, you didn't want the NKVD just having all this power over the government you're trying to control at the same time. So the secret police essentially gains too much power and needs to be wiped away and started fresh. But at the same time, that's the issue. The secret police gains too much power. You have to start fresh every time because there's no checking. There's nobody checking the secret police organizations within the USSR or in general, and this leads to inner turmoil in general, which leads to just continuous oppression and assassinations.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
they
like
just
the self. Sorry, do I go ahead, Mark?
go
No,
ahead,
go
no,
ahead,
JP,
JP.
go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. The self-fulfilling prophecies and the lack of government control that starts right back in the Okhrana. They appoint this guy called Zubatov in Moscow, and he sets out to modernize the Okhrana to deal with the revolutionary movements that are growing in the 1890s. It's got a couple of different things going on. He creates government-controlled trade unions to undermine the workers' movements, and but once they're created, uh, they have to do what trade unions do. Otherwise, why would anybody join them? So he's been appointed by a conservative government, which is completely opposed to making concessions to workers' movements, to create workers' movements that will petition the government for improvements in their condition. And so, of course, because neither of those missions can be fulfilled properly, they can't be reconciled, and eventually it gets out of control. Ends up with a general strike in Odessa that the police and the Cossacks are called in, and it's violently suppressed. And then Zubatov gets fired, and the unions continue without him. And he's also the person that moves these double agents onto being like a core policy of the Okhrana. He actually was a revolutionary himself in his youth, and he trains these people to infiltrate. And it's the same thing, right? Once they're in there, they can't just sabotage every campaign and hand everybody over to the police. Otherwise, they blow their cover. So they have to get involved in it. And the Okhrana agrees to them carrying out terrorist attacks and assassinating people. And even when they move up to one of his agents, Azef, assassinates the Minister of the Interior, who's supervising the whole operation. And then they just carry on with him there. So there's no reason to remove him just because he's assassinated the Minister of the Interior. Everything within the Okhrana becomes secret and compartmentalized. They don't tell the government what they're doing. They don't tell each other what they're doing, and it just carries on from there with double dealing, fake organizations, propaganda, and the whole framework that the more famous Soviet security organs take and extend to the whole country was developed quite clearly within the late Okhrana period.
I see we have a number of questions here. First one I think is from Ethan. Why are Russian secret forces seen as especially brutal compared to those of other countries? I think there's been some really bad secret police over the centuries. Different the Nazis had it with the Gestapo and the SS, and especially the Gestapo, and you have other countries that have suppressed a lot of people. It's just that I think with Russia and the Soviet Union, there's a lot more publicized, because they were our big enemy during the Cold War. One of the books I always like to look at is something called the Mitrokhin Archive, which is one of the people who was able to collect all these papers and communiques between the Soviets and their spies around the world, and it's a great insight into what they were doing. And under Stalin's time, it was particularly brutal, especially those great purges. One of the episodes that I'm going to be doing in a few weeks is my brother gave me a book for Christmas that was the actual trial of people like Bukharin and Rykov and those. It was translated. It's the entire translation of the trials of one of the great purges and how they were torturing these poor people, and then, executed all but 2 of them out of the 21 on trial. And the 2 that, were sent to the gulags as soon as Germany, attacked Russia, they were both, executed right away. So they were particularly brutal, but you can look at many other countries that have done quite a bit the same. They were just, I think, had more publicity behind them than some of the others. Any thoughts?
I think, yeah, I think part of it is the scale, just that Russia and the Soviet Union were big countries. So the numbers are bigger than, say, Croatia or, Albania, which had brutal secret police of their own. Many countries had brutal secret police. I don't think the Russians were especially brutal. And I think it's also that some parts of it are just difficult to understand. Like, if we have a secret police that's taking down actual enemies of the regime, we understand what they're doing. If the NKVD is rounding up the communists for no reason no one knows and shipping them off to the gulag, we don't know why they're doing it. Or if they're deporting entire ethnic groups because they're suspected traitors, while at the same time thousands of people from those ethnic groups are serving in the Red Army, fighting at the front. It's also hard to understand what the motivation is behind it. So I think those are a couple of things that contribute to the Russian secret police standing out amongst others.
And I was going to agree with JP on that. So
Hey, well, we are at the halfway point, so if you'd like me to step in and be your question asker, I'd be happy to do that.
Please do.
Okay. So we've covered the brutal question. How has propaganda influenced popular understanding of Russian history within Russia?
I can take that one if you guys don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think especially having the most recent interaction with having just been in Russia in 2019, so I don't know if anyone else has been there since 2019, but well, within Russia, especially further and further into 2025, things have been taking a much more pro-Russian, everyone's against us outlook. And even being involved in social circles, I have quite a few friends who are Russian. They come up and ask, why does everybody hate us? Like, we're not doing anything wrong. But because that's the actual regime just going in and showcasing, like, the same way, if Americans would know, if you watch Fox News, you're not going to hear about what's going on versus if you watch anything else but that, you're going to hear different sides of the story. It's the same thing in Russia, but because they have more control over what's shown in the media and it's more of a one-party system under Putin, and all the oligarchs work for Putin or alongside Putin, they don't get to hear things on a day-to-day basis that most people will. And not to say that they aren't educated, because you'll have quite a few Russians who are well educated and they know what's going on. But it's the same way here. You're going to have a majority of people who don't care enough out to see what's going on outside of their lives, because you're trying to survive in a country that is trying to, where you're not getting paid enough to meet your rent, you're not getting enough to survive to buy groceries, prices are going up, and you're just trusting what the government's telling you because you've had no reason to not trust them, essentially. Because and then when you have a scapegoat, you have that scapegoat from outside, especially when you're seeing like, oh, see, everyone's sanctioning us when we're trying to liberate Ukraine from those Nazis, quotation marks. So that's kind of like you don't look further into things when you're just trying to survive. And that's what I think why people especially in Russia, look at Russian history in a different light than how we look at it from outside, essentially.
And I totally agree with you on that one. I just see that, all the time with, I get contacts from people in Russia going, why are you so negative about what we're doing here? And you're not here listening to us. And then I, hear from some of why these oligarchs are going to say and stay with that line, because otherwise they'd be defenestrated. We have the one oligarch who supposedly fell out of a window with an IV bag attached to his arm at the pole, falling out of a hospital. And you have others who just all of a sudden, are falling out of windows and their whole families are shot. And they said it was, mass suicide. You're like, oh, okay. So there's a fear factor in that too, that they want to believe, because if you don't, what are the consequences of that?
Right.
Absolutely.
I think in most Western countries, there's been a reassessment of a lot of their past. And in the post-war period, we find that history becomes more social history about the people. And in more recent decades, it's more history of the marginalized in various ways has become important. But in Russia, history in like the popular sense is still history of the state. There are lots of good historians in Russia who do good work, but they're not there. If you see history on television or history on radio, the history that's taught in schools, it's the history of the state. And I think that's a big difference between how Russians are understanding their past and what maybe in other countries.
So Wesley asks, how much of the reputation of the various secret police organs was propaganda itself? If I was at the head of a secret police, I would want people to be afraid of it and think it was all powerful and very, very scary.
I don't think it's much propaganda at all. It's actual, like they did these things.
I think the later period there's a fair amount of propaganda.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the later period, yes, closer to the fall of the Soviet Union for sure.
Certainly Western media is a form of that propaganda as well.
Yeah.
I think Western propaganda, Western media definitely overhypes their competence.
Oh, definitely. Yes. Definitely true. There's no Russian KGB agent that's actually that great.
During the Great Purges, people would hear, the secret police coming up the stairs and they were just like, I'll just jump out the window. I'll just kill myself beforehand. That was the kind of fear level that they had. They were, when my father and I traveled to East Berlin in 1970, and we had a relative who was a physicist, and of course he all of a sudden couldn't show up to the dinner, and so I got to meet, my cousin and my aunt who were there in East Berlin, and we were followed the entire time. By this is in the middle of the summer, and there's these two, we could tell they were pretty Russian looking, and with the big hats and the long coats, and we're in August, they were pretty obvious there, and it was just it was a strange feeling to be followed. being born in America. My parents were, I'm the firstborn in my family and came from Europe. And my dad's like, did you see across the street? And he goes, they've been following us for the past like mile or so that we were walking around. And so they would go after you. And we knew that we had to be very careful with what we talked to our relatives about. And
Mhm.
my uncle was able to come out because he was in his 80s. He lived in Leipzig and he visited us in Wiesbaden. He was still scared to say anything because he just felt like if I say the wrong things, what's going to happen to me when I go back, and have to face the German secret police, the Stasi,
Right.
who were particularly brutal.
So let's switch this with Luke's question, which is that Russian propaganda seems to be quite negative, and especially when we're discussing things like secret police forces. So what examples of positive Russian propaganda are there, and what was the Russian soft power like?
Honestly, I think it's the stuff that got the people to rise up is against the empire. Because you have to rile up all these people with a common problem. So the early, Reds, they did a great job of being able to grab people until, of course, the revolution completely started and they started mass murdering people again. Um, but they, even with that, like you still have like come together. A lot of positive messaging came from that too.
I think Russia had quite strong positive propaganda and soft power image as a anti-imperialist force
Hmm.
during the decolonization period in Asia and Africa. This was quite undermined when Stalin died and Khrushchev came out and revealed that everything had been a lie, which it set them back and then created a competition with China trying to usurp their place as the main anti-imperialist power. But definitely for a few decades, they did successfully present themselves that way to the developing world.
I will say those Sino-Soviet posters were fantastic.
Well, that's
Of the
Ethan's next question was about best era of USSR propaganda aesthetically. So maybe you want to jump right there.
the Stalinist era, 100%.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
20s carried on for a bit, but yeah.
Yeah.
When the artists were still believers that communism would bring the bright world of the future, and there was a whole outburst of creativity and new ways of designing things and new aesthetics. Yeah.
There was a Life magazine back in the 1940s that featured Stalin on the cover. And there was a lot of propaganda of how great they were. They were fighting the Nazis and the fascists, and they were our friends. And here's all the great cultural and artistic things they did. I actually did an episode just on that issue of Life magazine. And that was an amazing piece of propaganda. I mean, there was no mention of anybody being purged or anything like that. It was all, puppy dogs and kisses and everything was just fine. These, amazing Russians, Soviets fighting, against this evil Hitler. And it was in our own magazines here. So, that was a pretty golden age of propaganda during World War II after they turned on, after the Germans invaded. So,
speaking of World War II, Alan, go ahead, Roberto.
Oh no, I was just gonna tag in and say like even like Stalin's image within like the former Soviet states is still within a crossroads of being like very good image or a very bad one. So like even though we know like oh he did all these horrible things over there, it's like yeah, but like he saved us. So you have this whole image of like yeah, he did these bad things, but he also got us through World War II. He stopped the Nazis. He basically brought us forward versus what happened afterwards.
So, speaking of World War II, Alan's question says, in the West, we tend to think of Goebbels and the Nazis as having the leading totalitarian propaganda organization of the period. But was Soviet propaganda just as good, better, or just different?
I think it was definitely better.
Oh, definitely better.
Soviets were much more organized. It was much more thought out and planned. I mean, a lot of the Nazi stuff was just really ad hoc personal initiatives.
Okay,
I mean,
interesting.
even when the Reds took over, like most of Russia, they went for the communication first. They knew what they were doing. They were just a much better organized organization, and they allowed creatives in there at the beginning. So that's why you have such like fantastic propaganda pieces because you had people who were open and allowed to write about these things that they strongly believed in versus here's a state apparatus that we have to follow this one set of rules. Um, of course, the Reds turned into that later,
Hmm.
but you had that beginning of we have the creatives on our side who want to implement
And
these changes.
they had real ideals, which
Yeah.
the Nazis were about, conquest and
Hmm.
the final solution. They didn't have the same kind of ideals. Especially the Soviets didn't go out with we're going to create a totalitarian state. It was like we're going to solve hunger and we're going to solve housing and we're going to free women from the household drudgery. They presented a lot of things that were attractive to people, which was why they could have positive propaganda within the country, and it would be the country was receptive to them because they were offering things that people wanted.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in because my father grew up in Nazi Germany, and he was a concert pianist, blind in one eye. Didn't preach in the war, but he told me, he said, some of the things that they would tell us, we knew were absolute BS. That it was all just made up, and many of us knew that it wasn't true,
Hmm.
and it was just done so clumsily because many of the Nazi leaders were not the most intelligent people in the world. They were not really that well educated. They were, angry racists who would put out things. And, my grandfather, I consider a hero. I mean, he told the Schaus family, anybody joins the Nazi party, you're finished. You're done with this family. You will never have a
Mm.
seat at our table ever again. One
Mm.
did. He was a restaurateur, and he was right next to the headquarters of the Nazi party.
Oof.
And he said, I had to do that. My grandfather refused and never allowed him back. And my favorite story about my dad, my grandfather, the the Gestapo came into his house. He was a world-renowned violinist, and he didn't have a picture of Hitler on the wall. And they
Mm.
said, "We don't have it by the next time we come here. We will take you and we will put you in a concentration camp." So what does he do? He puts up a picture of Hitler shaking hands with Molotov. And so when they came back, this is a ballsy man, I tell you.
Mm.
And
Mm.
and they go,
Spicy.
"What is this? It's abominable. How could you do this?" And he goes, "It follows the law. The law says I have to have a picture of the Fuhrer on the wall, and there it is."
Mm. Oof.
So
Spicy.
wish he
So we
was
have
still around. Something else.
Right. Amazing. We
Mhm.
have two questions left. We have 7 minutes, so let's see how we can do this. John asks, how did Soviet Islamophobia differ from American Islamophobia?
Oh, well, Soviet Islamophobia is quite a different subject. Russia, of course, has a different history with Islam to
Mhm.
most Western countries. Russia conquered the Kazan Khanate back in the middle of the 16th century, which made it the first European country that ruled a Muslim population.
Mm.
And there was various attempts at Christianization at different times, but generally there was not. They were accepted as Muslim subjects.
Mm.
You could say that definitely there was some kind of ambivalence, and this did carry on down to the Soviet times. In the early Soviet period, certainly the attitude towards Islam was very much the same as the attitude towards Christianity. The Soviets, the Bolsheviks, were atheists and they were violently opposed to religion.
Mm.
Um, so they dismantled any independent religious power, especially if we're talking Central Asia, which had very strong traditions of Muslim learning. Bukhara, Samarkand had been Islamic centers for 1,000 years at this point.
Mm.
and they did subvert it. They had official after the Second World War, as they brought back the Orthodox Church, they also brought back Islam. They had official Islamic organizations that were used for social manipulation, just the same. So definitely a very different course to the Islamophobia you'd find in the US or some other Western countries, but far too big a subject to deal with in 7 minutes.
Absolutely, definitely. So then let's get to this last question, because this might be a perfect one to wrap up on, which is, how does Russian propaganda nowadays compare to Soviet propaganda back then? Is it getting more similar?
I think it's a lot worse these days. It's completely different. The creatives are no longer there. I think, honestly, I would say it's more similar to Nazi Germany, where it's just more on personal initiative versus, just to bring back what JP said and Mark said. It's just like, it's more so on the personal initiative by the state versus creatives with an ideal, because you have this oligarchic nation that wants to retain power. The people just are ambivalent, and the ones who are the creatives with the ideals are all leaving. So,
Mm, mm-hmm.
so because of that, Russian propaganda today is, you can much more easily see through it because there's no sense of desire or ideals behind it. Like Soviet propaganda, you look at it and you're like, yeah, I can agree with that. This is something that I look at and I enjoy. Like I have a few Soviet
Mm.
propaganda posters at home because I'm like, these are things that I would still believe in today. And one of these things is just like, you know, Russia today is, it's more so like an artificial nation because it was put together by the remnants of whatever was left of the KGB and then taken over. So
Okay.
I don't know what else you
Yeah,
guys have to add to that.
yeah,
3 minutes. Final thoughts.
Putin's created nothing. There's
Mhm.
there's nothing there. It's just about grabbing whatever you can grab. It's a completely a rapacious oligarchy, and anything that people thought was good from their Soviet times, the education, social safety net, free housing, like has all been gradually destroyed. If you look at what Russian emigres have created around the world in the last 30 years, and think, well, why haven't they made something in Russia?
Mm.
Because they couldn't. If you wanted to make something, you needed to leave. You could steal something and exploit it. That was about all you could do.
Yeah, and even then, like I still think it's very much a, you don't have the ability to do the things you want because there's no sense of expression anymore. People just are downtrodden over there.
Mm-hmm. Mark, final
Yeah, I think
words?
it's very, yeah, it's kind of clumsy the way
Hmm.
the way I'd put it, from the way Putin and those, I mean, there's statements like they're going to send missiles into London if we keep on supplying weapons to Ukraine. I mean, it's like preposterous. You're not going to send any intercontinental ballistic missiles toward London. I mean, you just wipe out your entire country in response. It's just, it's very clumsy, heavy-handed. It's like they're trying to beat a small nail with a big club. I think it's just,
Mm.
it's a lost art over there. As you said, most of the really, high-tech people and the smart people are leaving, and they have left, and we're still, trying to get out. I think most of the smart people have already gotten out of it already.
Hmm.
Well, excellent. I think that's a perfect place to wrap. Thank you so much for being here. If you have more questions for our panelists, the lobby chat is a great place to do it, or you could bring it to the after party. Stay tuned. There will be another panel in this room. But thank you so much to JP, Mark, and Roberto.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
До свидания.
Right. And we'll pop backstage. Stop recording.